Hello, it's me, Johanna, and now we're doing part 2 out of 4 parts about the psychology IA. So last video, I went through how to write your introduction to get all of the marks that are possible for the introduction. Today, we'll be talking about the exploration and how to get all of the marks possible for the exploration. This section is all about your procedure. Basically, there are 4 marks possible. And these are determined by if you have explained the research design, the sampling technique, the choice of participants, the controlled variables, and the choices for, choice of materials. So almost every single person writing a psychology IA will have the same research design and sampling technique. The most common research design is the independent measures design, meaning that no participant participates in both conditions. They only participate in one condition. So if you need 20 people to participate in each condition, you will need 40 people because each participant is not doing both of the versions. This is actually really good because you avoid order effect and like practice effect. Like and also they will be less likely to figure out what your hypothesis is and then do like the screw you effect or any of that. If you're wondering what these terms are that I'm using, you can go and watch my videos from Psychology Chapter 1 that explains all this stuff. So sampling technique, opportunity sampling is basically everybody's go-to because basically your participants, I keep saying basically a lot, but anyhow, your participants are just the people who are most accessible to you. So you all know what materials are and participants are, so I won't explain that, but a controlled variable, just in case you don't know, is a variable that has to stay the same throughout the entire experiment. You are not changing it, you are not measuring it, it just has to stay constant. For example, the amount of time the participants get to do the task, whatever the task may be. So now we're going to go into the essay to look at a real life example. This essay did get 22 out of 22 marks. It will be linked down below. So here this student has written a bunch of paragraphs that sort of mixes all the concepts. In this first paragraph they talk about research design, sampling technique, and choice of participants. Now in my personal essay, I made it even more clear for the examiners, so I had a subheading called design or research design, and underneath I explained which one I used, and then I had another subheading called sampling technique. So that's just a personal preference for me because I want to make it as easy for the examiner as possible to see that I have achieved the marks for the criteria. So if you want to make it even easier, you can do that, but this is fine as well. When it comes to writing your procedure, you can write it in bullet points, or you can write, or like in steps, be like, first step, we did this. Or you can write it as like paragraphs, but you have to remember that you're writing it in past tense because like it's what you did. You're not writing what you're going to do. So in this essay, they start by stating that they used an independent samples design or independent measures design. Those are the same thing. And they explained what it is and then said that this was done to ensure that participants do not benefit from practice, blah, 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 blah. That's what basically you have to do for each of these points. You have to say, I'm using this is what it means, this is why, or like this is one positive with it, blah, 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 whatever. Then they talk about sampling technique, which as I explained previously is almost always opportunity sampling, so they did use opportunity sampling. They explained their choice of participants, aka I'm using IB students that are in the first year because blah da 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 da. That's basically how you do that. And then controlled variables. So here you don't have to say my controlled variables are da 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 da. You just have to mention things that you controlled to keep the same throughout, like sort of randomly. And this student has it sort of mixed in. You see that there's one in the first paragraph where they talk about how they wanted to keep the English proficiency level the same for both groups. And then they had another one in the second paragraph that is like they made sure that the letters only half of the words had the letter E in them, like stuff like that. Obviously, this will be very different depending on what experiment you are replicating, so you can sort of just like blend it in throughout. For me personally, I had a subheading called procedure where I went through everything I did, and in that one I sort of combined it in there rather than like randomly throughout the whole thing. To my knowledge, there isn't a specific number of controlled variables that you are supposed to have in psychology. However, in biology, they always say name at least 5. So I would recommend for you to do that anyway, just in case. Like, don't stick with 3, just name 5, just because. So the paragraphs you can see on screen now are basically just explaining the procedure. As I said, for me personally, I would make a subheading called procedure and explain it. Some important things to think about while explaining the procedure is to talk about the ethical practices that you followed, aka debriefing, briefing, and consent forms. These should all be within your appendix, and you have to refer to them in the procedure. So you should say, all of the consent forms were handed out, and then in brackets be like Appendix 1. And in Appendix 1, you should have an empty consent form. And then you should say, before we began, we had a standardized briefing with the students. So a standardized briefing is basically you saying, hello, we are here today to do this. You are anonymous. You can leave whenever you want. Da 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 da. The data will be used for this. Da 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 da. This is what we're experimenting. You know, a little like explanation of what you're doing, and then you have a debriefing where you explain in detail like exactly what you were checking, because obviously them knowing what you're checking might alter the results of your experiment, so the briefing is like less detailed than the debriefing. But these are all super important, and you have to have the standardized briefing and debriefing also in your appendix, and you have to refer to it in the procedure. It is also important to explain how you allocated participants into each condition. So essentially you have to do some type of random allocation. For instance, in this essay, they talk about how they flipped a coin to randomly allocate people. That's super good. You know, you have to have like some reason for why you put one person in a specific group and why you put another person in the other group. Other than that, you just literally write what you have done. So a quick summary of everything we said in this video is you are writing your procedure. You mention the independent measures design or whatever design you're using. You mention your sampling technique. You mention what materials you're using. You mention who your participants are, aka their ages, genders, whatever. And you mention at least 5 controlled variables. That's it. If you do that, then you should get a really good grade. So that was part 2 over. Please feel free to subscribe to make sure you will catch parts 3 and 4. And you can always go back and watch part 1 if you need it. So goodbye. I hope you learned something.